Your little water hole is a violation, and if you don't cap it and pay the $5,000 fine by Friday, we'll have it filled with concrete and bill you for the privilege." The words, laced with the kind of saccharine poison only a true suburban tyrant can muster, hung in the humid afternoon air. The woman who uttered them, standing on the edge of my freshly mown lawn with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy text, was the physical embodiment of a stereotype I'd only ever read about online. She was plus-sized, squeezed into a pastel-yellow pantsuit that strained at the seams, with a helmet of sprayed blonde hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire. Her name, I would soon learn, was Karen, and she was the president of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. My new home, my supposed sanctuary. For 25 years, I'd worn the uniform of the United States Army, retiring as a colonel in the Corps of Engineers. I'd overseen infrastructure projects in places where the rule of law was a suggestion, and a contract was something you enforced with armed guards. I'd dealt with warlords, corrupt officials, and logistical nightmares that would make a saint swear. I thought I had seen the pinnacle of petty, power-hungry bureaucracy. I was wrong. I had never met an HOA president. She stood there, a smug little smirk playing on her lips, enjoying the spectacle she was creating. A few neighbors were peeking through their blinds, their curiosity piqued by the official-looking woman haranguing the new guy. This was my welcome to the neighborhood moment. Not a casserole or a friendly wave, but a $5,000 threat delivered by a woman who looked like she gargled with vinegar. If you think that's insane, and believe me, it gets a whole lot crazier, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends, because this wasn't just an argument over a well. It was the beginning of a war. And Karen had made the catastrophic mistake of picking a fight with a man whose entire life had been about strategy, regulations, and understanding the terrain better than the enemy. She just didn't know what kind of terrain she was standing on. My pivot back to the situation was seamless, my face a mask of practiced calm I'd perfected in tense negotiations in far-flung war zones. I had bought this specific property, a 5-acre lot at the very edge of the development, for two reasons. First, the space. After decades in close quarters, I wanted a buffer. Second, and far more importantly, was the well. It was a deep-bore artesian well, drilled 80 years before the first foundation for Oak Creek Estates was ever poured. It was grandfathered in, fully documented on the deed, inspected by the county, and registered with the state. It was one of the primary selling points of the property, offering complete water independence from the municipal supply, a feature I, as a man who appreciates self-sufficiency, valued immensely. My retirement plan was simple: a quiet life, a big garden, and a workshop where I could finally finish restoring my 1968 Mustang. My post-military career was supposed to be the quiet part of my life, a desk job as a regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency. It was a civilian role, but one that utilized my background in engineering and logistics. It was mostly policy, paperwork, and oversight. It was supposed to be boring. Karen, with her concrete threat, was about to make my life anything but. I let her pronouncement hang in the air for a moment longer, studying her. She thrived on this. The power, the intimidation, the way she held that clipboard, not as a tool for notes, but as a scepter of her miniature kingdom. "Ma'am," I began, my voice even and low, a tone I'd used many times to de-escalate situations far more volatile than this one. "My name is Alex Vance. I just closed on this property last week. The well you're referring to is a legally deeded and registered appurtenance to the property. It predates this entire development." Her smirk tightened. "I don't care if it was drilled by Moses himself. It's an unapproved structure according to the Oak Creek covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It's a liability, and it's an eyesore." I glanced back at the wellhead. It was a discreet 6-inch steel pipe, capped and locked, surrounded by a small, neat concrete pad barely visible above the grass. An eyesore? The McMansion across the street, painted a truly offensive shade of salmon pink, was an eyesore. My well was practically invisible. I'd be happy to review the specific bylaw you're referring to, I said, extending a hand. If you can show me the article and section in the CC&Rs, we can discuss it. This was a test. My experience taught me that people who weaponize rules often have only a superficial understanding of them. They count on you not reading the fine print. Karen's face faltered for a fraction of a second. She hugged the clipboard tighter. I don't have to show you anything. You were given a copy of the bylaws at closing. It's your responsibility to read them. Section 4, paragraph B, unapproved structures. The fine stands, $5,000, Friday. She turned on her heel, a maneuver that displayed a surprising amount of torque, and marched back toward the sidewalk, her wide-legged pants swishing with righteous indignation. I watched her go, not with anger but with a cold, calculating clarity. She hadn't just made a demand, she had declared her intentions. She wanted a fight. She had no idea I was the one person in this entire state she should never have picked that fight with. The war for Oak Creek Estates had begun, and the first shot had just been fired directly at my most valuable asset. The battle wouldn't be fought with threats and fines, but with the very thing she thought was her greatest weapon, the rules. That evening, with the sun casting long shadows across my 5 acres of supposed freedom, I turned my dining room into a command center. The formidable binder of HOA documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, sat in the center of the table like an unexploded ordnance. My wife, Sarah, who had endured more military relocations than she cared to count, came in with 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the binder, then at me. First week, and we're already at war with the neighbors? She asked, a wry smile on her face. She knew the look in my eyes. It was the same one I got when a supply convoy was late, or a construction project hit bedrock where there should have been soft clay. It was problem-solving mode. Not the neighbors, I clarified, taking a sip of coffee. The local warlord. Goes by the name of Karen. I spent the next 4 hours dissecting that document. It was a masterpiece of poorly written, intentionally vague legalese, designed to grant maximum discretionary power to the board while providing minimal clarity to the homeowners. I finally found the clause she'd vaguely referenced. Section 4, paragraph B, approval of structures. It stated, no structure, including but not limited to fences, sheds, gazebos, or other outbuildings, shall be erected, placed, or altered on any lot until the construction plans and specifications and a plan showing the location of the structure have been approved by the Architectural Control Committee. I read it 3 times. The language was clear. It applied to things being erected, placed, or altered. My well was drilled into the ground 80 years ago. It wasn't erected or placed, it was subterranean. It was infrastructure, not a gazebo. It was a classic case of a bureaucrat stretching a rule far beyond its intended scope to fit their agenda. This was Karen's weapon, and it was flimsy. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. My heart didn't even flutter. This was escalation, predictable and clumsy. I signed for it, opened it, and read. The fine had doubled to $10,000 for failure to comply and continued defiance of a board directive. The letter, signed with a flourish by Karen as president, also included a formal notice of intent to place a lien on my property if the fine and the remediation costs for filling the well were not paid within 30 days. It was an astonishing act of aggression. She wasn't just trying to bully me, she was trying to create a legal and financial chokehold before I even had a chance to unpack all my boxes. She was a shark that smelled blood, assuming I was just another homeowner who would roll over and pay to make the problem go away. That afternoon, I decided to do some reconnaissance. I took a walk around the neighborhood, a friendly new guy getting the lay of the land. I struck up a conversation with an elderly man named George, who was meticulously weeding his flower bed. When I mentioned I was the new owner of the old Miller place, his eyes lit up with a sad sort of recognition. "Ah, the one with the well," he said, his voice dropping. "You've met Karen, then?" I nodded. George sighed, leaning on his trowel. He told me about his fight with her. A small tool shed, built by his father in the 90s, perfectly maintained, was deemed an unapproved structure last year. He fought it, but she buried him in fines and legal threats until he paid a contractor $2,000 to tear down a piece of his family history. She has it out for anyone with a property that's a little different, George whispered, glancing over his shoulder as if she might materialize from the azalea bushes. She wants conformity, everything the same beige color, the same manicured lawn. Well, that's the ultimate act of nonconformity to her. Independence. She can't stand it. He wasn't the only one. A young family 2 streets over told me about the $3,000 fine they'd received for their children's swing set, which was allegedly the wrong shade of forest green. They had to take it down. The stories painted a clear picture. Karen was a predator who used the HOA bylaws as her hunting ground, preying on anyone who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. Her power was derived entirely from the fear and apathy of the residents. That was about to change. She had finally targeted someone who wasn't afraid, wasn't apathetic, and whose entire career had been built on dismantling systems of oppression far more entrenched than a suburban HOA. My first official counteroffensive was a letter, but it wasn't the kind of angry, rambling letter Karen was probably used to receiving. It was a cold, precise surgical instrument. I drafted it on my personal letterhead, citing the specific language from Section 4, Paragraph B, and methodically explaining why it did not apply to a pre-existing, legally deeded, subterranean water well. I attached a copy of my property deed, the county survey map highlighting the well's registration number, and the State Water Resource Board's documentation. I then moved from defense to offense. I formally requested a hearing with the full HOA board to discuss what I termed the board's gross misinterpretation of the governing documents and the president's subsequent harassment and issuance of unlawful fines. I used phrases like tortious interference with property rights and potential for personal liability of board members for acting outside the scope of their authority. To cap it off, I CC'd the letter to Jacob Turner, Esquire, my old friend from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, who now ran a successful private practice. Jake wasn't officially my lawyer yet, but the presence of his name on the letter was a clear signal. I have legal counsel, and we are not backing down. I sent the letter via certified mail, with return receipt requested, to Karen and to the home addresses of the other 4 board members listed on the HOA website. I wanted to make sure they couldn't claim they never saw it. I wanted to break Karen's information monopoly. Karen's response was a masterclass in hubris. 2 days later, instead of a letter from a lawyer or a notice of a hearing, I found a bright orange sticker slapped on my front door. It was a final notice of violation, a document that looked like it was designed by someone who'd lost a graphic design competition. In crude, bold letters, it declared that remediation action was scheduled for the following Monday. It stated that a contractor hired by the HOA would be entering my property to permanently decommission the offending structure, and that all costs would be added to the lien against my home. She hadn't just ignored my letter. She had spat on it. She had bypassed any semblance of due process and jumped straight to the execution phase. It was a declaration of war, a direct physical threat against my property. As I peeled the garish sticker off my door, the anger I had been suppressing finally gave way to a cold, hard resolve. She had made this about more than just a well or a fine. She had made it about the fundamental right to be secure in one's own home. She thought she was an unassailable queen in her cul-de-sac castle, protected by her binder of rules. She was about to find out that her castle was built on a floodplain, and I was the one who controlled the dam. The time for letters was over. The time for quiet, methodical demolition of her little empire had arrived. She had threatened my well. She had no idea that in doing so, she had threatened the very water table her entire community depended on, and in the process, had drawn the attention of an entity far more powerful than any HOA. The threat to fill my well with concrete was a strategic error from which all of Karen's other mistakes would cascade. A civilian might see it as a simple act of property damage. A lawyer sees a tort, but an environmental engineer and federal administrator sees something far more serious: a potential violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. Improperly decommissioning a well isn't like filling a pothole. You can't just pour concrete down the shaft. A well is a direct conduit from the surface to an underground aquifer. Using the wrong materials or procedure can introduce gasoline, pesticides, bacteria, or other surface contaminants directly into the groundwater, poisoning the water source for an entire area. Karen's ignorant, brutish threat had unknowingly crossed a jurisdictional line, moving her from a neighborhood nuisance to a potential environmental criminal. This changed the entire battlefield. I was no longer just a homeowner defending his property. I was now a regulator with a professional and ethical obligation to investigate a credible threat to a public water source. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I went to my home office and logged into the public access portals of the U.S. Geological Survey and the EPA. This wasn't me using my official powers for personal gain. This was me, as a concerned citizen and an expert in the field, doing my due diligence. I pulled up the hydrogeological maps for my county. The screen glowed with a web of blue lines and shaded areas, a secret world of water flowing silently beneath our feet. My property, as I already knew, sat directly atop a sensitive recharge zone for the Trinity Aquifer, a major source of drinking water for the entire region. The little water hole Karen so derisively dismissed, was a direct tap into one of its cleanest, most pristine branches. The maps told another story too. The main Oak Creek Estates development, including Karen's house, drew its water from the municipal utility. That utility, in turn, drew its water primarily from a surface reservoir several miles away. Public records showed that this reservoir had been plagued with issues for years: low water levels during droughts, algae blooms in the summer, and rising treatment costs. The county had been trying to get funding to expand the reservoir for years, but it was a political hot potato. The most interesting piece of the puzzle, however, came from the county clerk's office database. I searched for all contracts between the Oak Creek Estates HOA and the Westford County Municipal Water Utility, and there it was, filed 3 years ago, shortly after Karen was elected HOA president. It was an exclusive provider agreement, locking the entire development into a 20-year contract with the utility, but buried in the addenda was the smoking gun. It was a clause I'd never seen in a municipal contract before. It was a bonus provision. For every private water well within the HOA's territory that was decommissioned and certified as abandoned, the utility would pay a $5,000 conservation bonus directly to the HOA. The motive was suddenly crystal clear. My $5,000 fine wasn't an arbitrary number. It was the exact amount Karen and the HOA stood to gain by forcing me to abandon my well. This wasn't about aesthetics or property values. It was a bounty. Karen was running a racket, hunting for wells to decommission so she could collect her fee from the water company, which in turn wanted to eliminate competition and force total dependence on its own, less reliable system. My independence wasn't just an insult to her authority. It was a threat to her revenue stream. She wasn't just a power-hungry bully. She was a financially motivated predator. And I had just found her playbook, her motive, and the weapon I would use to dismantle her entire operation. The fight was no longer just about my well. It was about exposing a corrupt agreement that preyed on the property rights of every resident in the community. She thought she was playing checkers in her backyard, but she had just stumbled onto a grandmaster's chessboard. With the bounty contract in hand, I called Jake. I emailed him the document, along with the geological surveys and Karen's threatening letters. His response came an hour later in a text message. "Holy hell, Alex. This isn't just an HOA dispute. This is RICO-level stuff. It's a coercive monopoly disguised as a neighborhood covenant." He confirmed my suspicions. The contract was legally dubious and created a perverse incentive for the HOA to harass homeowners with private wells. The conservation bonus was a kickback, plain and simple. We now had motive, means, and opportunity. But a direct legal challenge would be slow, dragging through the courts for months or years, while Karen continued to rack up fines and liens against me. We needed a different approach. We needed to let her walk right into a trap of her own making. The plan was simple and elegant. We would use her aggression and overconfidence against her. The first step was to fortify my property. That weekend, I installed a state-of-the-art security system. 4 high-resolution, night vision-capable cameras were positioned to give overlapping coverage of my entire front yard, with a particular focus on the gate and the wellhead. The system recorded to a cloud server, ensuring the footage would be safe even if the cameras were destroyed. Next, I went to the local hardware store and bought the largest, most legally intimidating no trespassing signs they had. The signs cited the state's criminal trespass statute and warned that violators would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I placed them at my property line and on the gate leading to the well. It was a clear, unambiguous warning. The final piece of the trap was one last letter. Jake drafted it, and it was a work of art. It was addressed to each member of the HOA board, sent individually to their homes via registered mail. It did not argue or plead. It simply stated the facts. It identified the well as my private property. It cited the relevant criminal statutes for trespass and destruction of property. It then stated in cold, clear language that any attempt by the HOA or its contractors to enter my property without my express written consent would be viewed as a criminal act. It specifically warned that any unauthorized tampering with the well would be considered a deliberate attempt to introduce contaminants into the aquifer and would be reported to the State Environmental Quality Board and the United States Environmental Protection Agency. The letter was designed to do two things. First, it would put every board member on notice, making it impossible for them to later claim ignorance or that they were just following Karen's lead. They were now all legally notified of the potential consequences. This created individual liability, which has a wonderful way of focusing the mind. Second, it was bait. I still did not reveal my position at the EPA. I signed the letter simply Alexander Vance, J.D., referencing the law degree I'd earned on the GI Bill years ago. It added a layer of legal seriousness without revealing the ace I was holding up my sleeve. We wanted Karen to see the letter not as a warning from a federal regulator, but as an empty threat from a litigious homeowner. We were counting on her ego, on her absolute belief in her own authority to make her ignore it. We were betting that she would see the cameras and the signs and the legal letter as a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down that she, in her supreme power, had to pick up. We sent the letters on Tuesday. The remediation action was scheduled for Monday. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. All we had to do was wait for the shark to bite. The week passed with an unnerving silence. No emails, no phone calls, no more orange stickers on my door. It was the calm before the storm, and I used the time to prepare. I spoke with George and a few other neighbors, not to rally them to my cause yet, but to let them know something might be happening on Monday and not to be alarmed by a potential police presence. I wanted witnesses, but I didn't want to put them in the line of fire. I briefed Jake on the final plan. He would be on standby, ready to move the moment we had confirmation of the trespass. Monday morning arrived, gray and overcast. The sky a dull, oppressive sheet of metal. I left for a meeting at my regional office, but in reality, I drove to a coffee shop a few miles away. There I opened my laptop and pulled up the live feed from my security cameras. I sat there sipping a black coffee, watching my empty front yard like a sniper on Overwatch. For hours, nothing happened. The mail carrier came and went. A dog walker passed by. I started to wonder if perhaps Karen had finally shown a flicker of common sense, if the legal letter had been enough to make her back down. Maybe the trap had been too obvious. Then at 10:32 a.m., a vehicle appeared at the end of my long driveway. It was a large, dual-axle flatbed truck, carrying a small cement mixer and several pallets of concrete bags. It was followed by a white pickup truck from a local company called D&R Contracting. My heart beat a little faster. This was it. The contractor's truck parked on the street, but the flatbed pulled right up to my gate. Two men in work boots and jeans got out and looked uncertainly at the no trespassing signs. They looked at the house, then back at each other. They were hesitant. They knew this was irregular. And then a third vehicle arrived, a pristine white Lexus SUV. Karen. She got out of her car, clipboard in hand, dressed in a power red blazer. She marched toward the contractors with an air of absolute authority. I could see her on camera, gesturing, pointing, her voice inaudible but her body language screaming with impatience. She pointed at the gate, then at the wellhead behind it. The contractors gestured toward the signs. Karen waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. This was the moment of truth. Would they listen to their better judgment or to the angry woman in the red blazer? Karen, apparently tired of the delay, strode to the gate herself. She produced a massive pair of bolt cutters from the back of her Lexus. With a grunt of effort that was clearly visible even on camera, she snapped the chain and lock I had placed on the gate. She threw the gate open and gestured for the contractors to proceed. That was the critical moment, the criminal act. She had now personally facilitated the trespass. The contractors, their reluctance seemingly overcome by Karen's sheer force of will, started unloading their equipment. The driver of the flatbed began to back the truck onto my property. The moment its rear tires crossed the property line and touched my grass, I made the call. I didn't call 911. I called the direct line to the county sheriff's dispatch, a number I knew from my professional work in coordinating with local law enforcement on environmental cases. I calmly identified myself and my address. I am reporting an active criminal trespass and attempted destruction of property, I said, my voice steady. There is a contracting crew with heavy equipment on my property, and they are attempting to illegally destroy a registered private water well. The property is clearly marked, and the trespassers have cut a lock to gain entry. The woman who hired them is on site, directing them. I then added the crucial phrase, the one I knew would elevate this from a simple dispute to a priority call. Given the nature of the well, their actions pose an immediate risk of contaminating the local water table. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a crisp, "Sir, we are dispatching deputies to your location immediately. Please remain on the line if it is safe to do so." I stayed on the line, my eyes glued to the screen. I watched as the contractors unspooled a hose from the cement mixer. They were preparing to follow their orders. They were minutes away from poisoning my water, and potentially the water of hundreds of my neighbors. Karen stood by, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk on her face. She thought she had won. Her victory was going to be short-lived. I arrived home just as two county sheriff's cruisers, lights flashing, pulled up behind the contractors' trucks, blocking them in. I had timed my drive perfectly, wanting to be there for the main event. I parked my car across the street and walked calmly up my driveway. The scene was pure chaos. The two deputies, both looking serious and unimpressed, were questioning the bewildered-looking contractors who were pointing frantically at Karen. Karen, for her part, was in full battle mode. She was waving her HOA binder in the senior deputy's face, her voice a shrill, piercing screech. "This is official HOA business officer. This is a covenanted community. We are simply enforcing the bylaws. This man," she said, jabbing a finger in the direction of my house, "is a delinquent homeowner who refuses to comply." The deputy, a tall man with a weathered face and a gaze that suggested he'd seen it all, looked from the binder to Karen, then over to the broken lock on my gate. "Ma'am, enforcing bylaws doesn't typically involve bolt cutters and trespassing. Did you have a court order to enter this property?" Karen sputtered. "A court order? We are the governing body. We don't need a court order. Our covenants are legally binding." This was the moment to make my entrance. I walked past Karen without a glance, my focus entirely on the deputy. "Good morning, deputy," I said, extending my hand. "Alex Vance. I'm the owner of this property. Thank you for the quick response." The deputy shook my hand. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" Before I could answer, Karen shrieked, "He's the one you should be talking to. He's the one violating the rules. He has an unapproved structure." I ignored her, maintaining eye contact with the officer. "Deputy, it's quite simple. This woman, acting as the HOA president, has hired this crew to illegally enter my property and destroy my well. I have documentation proving my ownership and the well's legal status. I also have letters, sent via certified mail, warning her and the entire HOA board that this action would be considered criminal." I handed him a folder I'd prepared. It contained copies of my deed, the well registration, the certified mail receipts, and the final warning letter Jake had drafted. The deputy took the folder and began to leaf through it, his expression growing more serious with each page. He looked at the contractor. "Were you aware you were on private property without the owner's permission?" The man swallowed hard. "She told us it was all taken care of. She said the HOA had the right to be here." The deputy turned his gaze back to Karen. Her face was turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The situation was slipping from her grasp, and she couldn't stand it. This was not how her carefully orchestrated power plays were supposed to go. The deputy then looked at me. "Sir, on the phone, you mentioned something about a risk of water contamination?" This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The culmination of my entire strategy. I allowed a moment of silence to hang in the air, drawing the attention of everyone present, the deputies, the contractors, even a few neighbors who were now openly watching from their lawns. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Karen. For the first time, she looked uncertain, a flicker of fear in her eyes. Then I looked back at the deputy. "Yes, officer," I said, my voice clear and authoritative. "Any improper decommissioning of a well of this type, especially one that taps directly into a major aquifer, can introduce surface contaminants into the groundwater. We're talking potential bacteriological contamination, chemical runoff. It's a serious public health risk. It's also a serious environmental crime." I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my wallet. I didn't flash it. I opened it slowly and removed my credentials, handing them to the deputy. He took the small leather case and read it. His eyes widened slightly. He looked up at me, then back at the ID, then back at me again with a newfound respect. "I'm Alexander Vance," I said, my voice dropping into the calm, official tone I used at work. "I'm the regional administrator for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and this HOA president just hired a crew to commit a potential federal felony on my property, which also happens to fall directly under the jurisdiction of my office." The silence that followed was absolute. The chirping of birds seemed to stop. The contractors looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them whole. But the best part, the image that will be forever seared into my memory, was the look on Karen's face. The crimson flush drained away, replaced by a pasty ghost-white pallor. Her jaw went slack, her smugness evaporating like mist in the morning sun. She had been the queen of this little fiefdom, a big fish in a tiny pond. She had just discovered that the quiet new neighbor she tried to bully was a great white shark. The immediate aftermath was a study in rapid de-escalation and the stark reality of consequence. The senior deputy handed my credentials back to me with a quiet, "Thank you, Mr. Vance." He then turned to his partner. "Cuff her." Karen's brain seemed to reboot, a screech of protest catching in her throat. "You can't. This is a misunderstanding. It's a civil matter." The deputy was unmoved. "Ma'am, you facilitated criminal trespass by cutting that lock, and you conspired to commit destruction of property. Given the potential environmental factors Mr. Vance has outlined, we're not taking any chances. You're being detained." As the deputy clicked the handcuffs onto her wrists, the sheer, satisfying clink of metal echoed across the lawn. The contractors, seeing their employer being arrested, immediately began cooperating, explaining that Karen had assured them all the legalities were handled and had shown them a copy of the HOA violation notice as their work order. They were terrified, and their fear made them truthful. They became the state's primary witnesses on the spot. By the time Karen was placed in the back of the cruiser, her face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage, the story was already spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. George was on his porch, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. The family with the non-compliant swing set were watching from their window, their kids pointing. The spell of fear Karen had woven over the community was broken. The untouchable queen had been dethroned in broad daylight. The next day, the second phase of my operation began. I walked into my actual office, not as Alex Vance the homeowner, but as Administrator Vance of the EPA. I convened a meeting with my chief counsel and the head of our enforcement division. I recused myself from directly overseeing the case to avoid any conflict of interest, but I laid out the facts of the situation as a reporting citizen and as an expert witness. I provided them with a copy of the HOA's contract with the Westford County Municipal Water Utility, highlighting the conservation bonus clause. My legal team was stunned. It was a blatant, documented scheme to suppress private water rights for financial gain, with potentially disastrous environmental consequences. An official EPA investigation was launched that very afternoon. It was no longer my personal fight. It had been elevated to a federal matter. The scope of the inquiry was broad: to investigate the contract for potential violations of antitrust laws, to audit the HOA's finances for evidence of fraud, and to assess whether this bonus scheme had been used to pressure other well owners in the past. Subpoenas were issued for all of the HOA's financial records, board meeting minutes, and all correspondence between Karen, the other board members, and the water utility. The full weight of the federal government was now bearing down on Karen's little kingdom. The news of her arrest and the subsequent investigation empowered the residents. My phone started ringing. George came over with a box full of meticulously documented correspondence from his own battle with Karen over his father's shed. Others followed. We received copies of exorbitant fines for trivialities: a basketball hoop left out overnight, the wrong kind of mailbox, holiday decorations left up 2 days too late. Each fine, each threat, was a piece of a larger puzzle. We started to cross-reference the dates of the most aggressive fining campaigns with the HOA's bank statements. A disturbing pattern emerged. Karen's crackdowns always seemed to coincide with periods when the HOA's coffers were running low, or right before she took a lavish vacation, which we learned about from her own boastful social media posts. She wasn't just a tyrant. She was using the HOA as her personal ATM, funded by the intimidation of her neighbors. The well bounty was just her most audacious scheme. The investigation into the HOA's finances and the water utility contract yielded results faster than any of us anticipated. The paper trail Karen left was not one of a criminal mastermind, but of an arrogant amateur who believed she would never be caught. The conservation bonuses from the water utility were just the beginning. We discovered that the kickbacks were twofold. The HOA received the $5,000 bonus, which was then funneled into a discretionary president's fund that Karen controlled with no oversight. But we also found evidence of direct payments from the utility's business development manager to a private consulting company. That company, a shell corporation with a P.O. box address, was owned by Karen's husband. She wasn't just getting a bonus for the HOA. She was getting a personal kickback for every well she managed to get filled. This was textbook fraud and racketeering. Furthermore, the financial audit revealed she had used HOA funds to pay for thousands of dollars in personal expenses, including legal fees for a lawsuit that had nothing to do with the community, lavish dinners, and even payments on her Lexus. She had been systematically embezzling from her neighbors for years, using the complex and confusing budget reports to hide her tracks. The evidence was so overwhelming that the county district attorney's office convened a grand jury. With criminal charges pending, the HOA was in chaos. The other board members, now facing potential civil and criminal liability themselves, were in a panic. An emergency community meeting was called. It was held in the local elementary school auditorium, and for the first time in years, it was packed. Over 200 homeowners showed up, angry and armed with their own stories of Karen's abuse. George, emboldened by the turn of events, stood up and called for a vote of no confidence in the entire board. Jake and I were invited to present our findings. We put the subpoenaed bank records and the water utility contract up on a projector screen. We showed the flow of money, the personal kickbacks, the embezzled funds. The room was a tinderbox of outrage. When we finished, the vote was nearly unanimous. The entire board, who had enabled Karen through their complicity and cowardice, was removed from power. An interim board was elected on the spot, with a reluctant but determined George at its head. The local news had gotten wind of the story, and a reporter from the city paper was in the back of the auditorium, scribbling furiously. The next day's headline was explosive. EPA administrator uncovers corruption scheme in his own neighborhood HOA. The story went viral. The water utility, caught in the media firestorm, went into full damage control. They fired the manager who had orchestrated the kickback scheme and publicly canceled their contract with the Oak Creek HOA. Karen was now completely isolated. She was facing a litany of felony charges. She had been publicly disgraced, and her entire power structure had been dismantled in less than a month. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn a week later. Her reign of terror was officially over. The final chapter of Karen's saga was written not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in the quiet, methodical process of the justice system she had so disdained. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the testimony of the contractors, her former board members, and a dozen of her neighbors, she accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony fraud and embezzlement. The federal environmental charges were held in abeyance, a hammer held over her head to ensure her cooperation. Her sentence was 5 years of probation, a permanent ban from ever serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity again. And, most importantly, she was ordered to pay full restitution. The court-appointed forensic accountants calculated the total amount she had skimmed and extorted over the years. It was a staggering sum. The money was paid back into the HOA's accounts, and a special fund was created to reimburse residents like George for the unjust fines and costs they had been forced to pay. My own $10,000 fine was, of course, nullified, and the HOA's new board sent me a formal, written apology. With the legal and financial battles won, the real work of healing the community began. Under George's steady leadership, the new board undertook a complete overhaul of the CC and RS. They hired an independent lawyer to help them redraft the documents, eliminating the vague, weaponized clauses and replacing them with clear, fair, and transparent rules. The Architectural Control Committee was reformed with a focus on reasonable guidance rather than punitive enforcement. For the first time, the HOA began to feel less like an occupying force and more like a genuine community organization. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. People started talking to each other again. The family with the non-compliant swing set put it back up, and no one said a word. George, with a little help from his neighbors, built a new shed in his backyard, better and stronger than the one Karen had forced him to destroy. The salmon pink McMansion was even repainted a tasteful, if still uninspired, shade of taupe. My life settled into the quiet rhythm I had craved. The restoration of my Mustang progressed. My garden began to produce its first crop of tomatoes. My job at the EPA returned to its normal, bureaucratic pace. The war was over. One warm evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the now peaceful neighborhood, I stood in my backyard next to the wellhead. I had just finished installing a new, silent, high-efficiency pump. I opened the brass spigot, and a stream of crystal-clear water gushed out, cold and pure. I filled a glass and drank deeply. It tasted of independence, of a victory hard won. It was a symbol of the principle I had fought for, that a person's home should be their sanctuary, not a battlefield for a petty tyrant's ego. George wandered over from his yard, holding 2 beers. He handed one to me, and we stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, looking out over Oak Creek Estates. "You know," he said finally, "for a while there, I forgot what it felt like to not be looking over my shoulder." "Thank you, Alex." I clinked my beer bottle against his. "We all did it together, George. It just took one person to be too stubborn to back down." We stood there as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, listening to the distant sounds of children playing and the gentle hum of a neighborhood at peace. The quiet life I had sought had finally been achieved. It had required one last battle, not in a foreign desert, but right here on my own front lawn. And in winning that fight, I hadn't just secured my own peace. I had helped restore it for an entire community. The water from my well had never tasted sweeter.